On a December evening in 1930, in the Harlem neighborhood of Upper Manhattan, a woman named Stephanie St. Clair sat in the tastefully furnished parlor of her apartment at 409 Edgecombe Avenue, the most prestigious residential address in Black New York. The building stood on the crest of Sugar Hill, overlooking the rooftops of the neighborhood below, and its tenants included W.E.B. Du Bois, the scholar and activist, Walter White, and the executive secretary of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and in years to come, a young attorney named Thurgood Marshall, who would one day sit on the Supreme Court of the United States. The company that St. Clair kept, even architecturally, tells you something about the woman. She was not hiding. She had never hidden. She lived at the pinnacle of her community, in plain sight, and she conducted her affairs with the kind of deliberate visibility that was, as in itself, a form of power. St. Clair was approximately 33 years old, though even this basic fact was a matter of some ambiguity. She had been born on the island of Guadeloupe in the French West Indies, or possibly Martinique, depending on the source, on December 24th, either in 1887 or 1897. The discrepancy of a full decade in her documented birth year was not accidental. Saint. Clair cultivated uncertainty about her origins the way a general cultivates confusion on a battlefield, deliberately and to her advantage. What is known with certainty is that she arrived in New York Harbor sometime around 1911, a young woman from the Caribbean who spoke French and, by some accounts, little English. She was listed on the steamship manifest as a servant. Within 12 years, she would be earning more than $200,000 a year, employing dozens of people, or living in one of the finest apartments in Harlem, and running one of the most profitable illegal enterprises in the city of New York. On this December night, St. Clair wore what those who remembered her described as her customary style, an elegantly cut dress, jewelry that was noticeable without being vulgar, and a colorful turban wrapped around her head, a signature that had become so closely associated with her public image that it functioned almost as a trademark. As she was known throughout Manhattan by several names. In the white newspapers, she was Queenie. In the black press, she was Madame St. Clair. Among those who worked for her and those who feared her, she was Madam Queen. And in the neighborhoods where her numbers runners collected betting slips from barber shops and beauty parlors and street corners every morning, she was simply the queen of the policy rackets. None of these names had been given to her by anyone else, as she had chosen them herself, cultivated them, and published them in paid advertisements in the newspapers. Stephanie St. Clair was perhaps the first person in Harlem's history to understand that in a world where black people were systematically rendered invisible, the act of naming yourself, loudly, publicly, and in print, was not vanity. It was a weapon. But on this particular evening, the weapon had been taken from her hands. 3 days earlier, she had been arrested by officers of the New York Police Department at 177 West 141st Street. They claimed to have found policy slips in her possession. She insisted she had been framed. Given her position as the boss of one of Harlem's largest numbers operations, the idea that she would personally carry incriminating evidence was, to anyone who understood how such organizations functioned, absurd. Bosses did not carry slips. That was what runners were for. The arrest was not about evidence. It was about power. And the power behind the arrest was not just the police, it was the system that the police served. A system of white-controlled organized crime that was, at that moment, in the process of dismantling everything Stephanie St. Clair had built. To understand what was now being taken from St. Clair, one must understand what the numbers game was and what it meant to the community that played it. The game was, in its mechanics, a simple illegal lottery. Players chose a three-digit number between 000 and 999 and placed a bet, sometimes as little as a penny, with a local numbers runner. The winning number was drawn daily from publicly available sources, such as the last three digits of the total handled by a particular clearinghouse of the New York Stock Exchange, or the Federal Reserve's daily balance figures. If your number matched, you won. The odds were long, but the stakes were low. And in a neighborhood where black people were systematically excluded from legitimate banking, investment, and credit, the numbers game served a function that went far beyond entertainment. It was, as historians have observed, the closest thing to a stock market that Black Harlem possessed. The bankers who financed the operations, of whom St. Clair was the most prominent, were, in effect, the community's shadow financial system. They employed hundreds of people. They financed small businesses. They circulated money within the neighborhood rather than allowing it to flow outward into the coffers of white-owned institutions that would never have served black customers. The numbers game was illegal, but it was also, in the distorted economics of a segregated city, indispensable. The insult that preceded the arrest was not subtle. It was delivered in the manner that insults are always delivered to those who have accumulated power without permission, through an intermediary, or with the understanding that the message would reach its intended audience. The intermediary, in this case, was the expanding operations of a man named Arthur Flegenheimer, known to every person in New York as Dutch Schultz. Schultz was a Bronx-based bootlegger and racketeer of German Jewish descent who had grown wealthy during Prohibition and who, as the repeal of the 18th Amendment loomed, was looking for new revenue streams. Yet he had identified the Harlem numbers racket as his next conquest. The numbers game was, at its peak in the late 1920s, generating millions of dollars annually. It employed hundreds of people in Harlem as runners, comptrollers, and collectors. It was, in the absence of a banking system that would serve black customers, the closest thing to a financial institution that the community possessed, and it was controlled almost entirely by black operators, of whom Stephanie Street. Clair was the most prominent and the most wealthy. Schultz did not bother with negotiation. He sent his men into Harlem and began, systematically, to take over. Numbers operators who had run their own small businesses for years were visited by Schultz's enforcers and told that they would now pay protection money or face the consequences. Those who refused were beaten. Some were killed. The violence was not random. It was methodical and designed to demonstrate that resistance was futile and cooperation was the only rational choice. Over the course of 1930 and into the early 1930s, the body count in this quiet war would rise to more than 40 dead, a figure that would have constituted a major crime wave in any other part of New York, but which, because the victims were black and the killings took place in Harlem, received relatively little attention in the white press. Street. Clair was offered the same terms as everyone else: submit, pay a percentage, and accept Schultz's authority, or face destruction. The offer was not made in person. Schultz did not come to Harlem himself, not at first, but through his representatives, men who arrived in the neighborhood with the confidence of an occupying army. The message was plain. Harlem's numbers game no longer belonged to its people. It belonged to Dutch Schultz, and St. Clair, the self-proclaimed queen of policy, and was now expected to become an employee. She said nothing. This was noted by those around her because silence from Stephanie St. Clair was, in their experience, more alarming than any outburst. She was known for her fierce temper, for her willingness to curse in multiple languages when angered, for her confrontational style and her refusal to defer to anyone, man, woman, cop, or criminal. Her silence, therefore, was not a sign of submission. It was a sign that something was being calculated. Around her, other numbers operators were folding. The black bankers who had built Harlem's policy racket into a multi-million-dollar enterprise were, one by one, accepting Schultz's terms or fleeing the city altogether. Some returned to the Caribbean islands from which they had emigrated. Others accepted positions as employees of the new white-controlled operation, running the same businesses they had once owned, but now as subordinates rather than principals. Casper Holstein, who had been the most prominent numbers banker in Harlem before St. Clair's rise, had already been weakened by a kidnapping, allegedly orchestrated by Schultz's associates, that had exposed the scale of his wealth and made him a target. By the early 1930s, the independent black numbers banks that had once numbered more than 30 were being reduced to a handful. St. Clair observed this attrition with the cold eye of a strategist. She saw what submission purchased, survival, perhaps, but not dignity and not independence. She chose differently. In the weeks that followed, St. Clair withdrew from the visible operations of her business. She did not appear at the locations where she had customarily conducted affairs. She did not send messages through her usual channels. She was not seen on the streets of Harlem with her customary entourage. To those who did not know her, it might have appeared that she was folding, and that the pressure from Schultz and the complicity of the police had finally accomplished what no competitor had ever managed, the retirement of Madam Queen. This appearance was incorrect. What St. Clair was doing, in those weeks of apparent retreat, was something far more dangerous and far more sophisticated than fighting back with fists or guns. She was assembling information. She was making records. She was preparing to use the one weapon that neither Dutch Schultz nor the corrupt officers who protected him had ever imagined a black woman in Harlem would wield. The truth, delivered in public, under oath, to a body with the power to act on it. The Seabury Commission, formerly known as the Investigation, led by Judge Samuel Seabury into corruption in New York City's magistrate courts and police department, had begun its work in 1930. It was, in the political landscape of the era, one of the most significant anti-corruption efforts in the city's history. Seabury and his investigators were looking for evidence that judges, lawyers, and police officers were conspiring to extort money from citizens and to protect illegal enterprises in exchange for bribes. They were looking, in other words, for exactly the kind of evidence that Stephanie St. Clair possessed in abundance. The realization that transformed St. Clair's approach was not a sudden epiphany, and it was the culmination of years of experience operating in a system that was rigged against her at every level. She had known since the beginning of her career that the numbers game existed in a gray zone, technically illegal but tolerated by the authorities so long as the appropriate payments were made. She had paid those payments faithfully, by her own later testimony, approximately $6,000 to $7,000 to various officers and officials, and in return, her runners had been largely left alone. The arrangement was corrupt, but it was stable. It allowed black operators to build wealth in a community that was denied access to legitimate financial institutions. It was, in the distorted logic of a segregated economy, a functioning system. What Schultz's invasion revealed was that the system had never been designed to protect people like St. Clair. It had been designed to extract money from them. As long as the payments flowed and the operations remained contained within Harlem, the police and the political establishment were content to let black people run their own shadow economy. But the moment a more powerful white operator decided he wanted that economy for himself, the same police who had taken St. Clair's money turned against her. The officers she had paid for protection now facilitated her arrest. The political connections she had cultivated were suddenly unavailable. The entire edifice of corrupt accommodation that had allowed her to build her enterprise was revealed in an instant as a structure that served white power and merely rented space to black ambition. This was the systemic insight that shifted St. Clair from defensive tactics to strategic offense. She was not facing a personal enemy. She was facing a system in which the police, the political establishment, and white organized crime functioned as interlocking parts of a single machine designed to control and exploit black communities. And she understood, with the clarity of a woman who had survived poverty, migration, violence, and imprisonment, that you could not defeat such a system by fighting it on its own terms. You could not outgun Dutch Schultz. You could not outbribe Tammany Hall. But you could expose the system to its own masters. Because the one thing that a corrupt system cannot survive is transparency. St. Clair's coalition was not assembled in a conference room or at a political rally. It was assembled in the pages of the Amsterdam News, one of the most important black-owned newspapers in the country, and through quiet conversations with those few individuals who had both the information and the courage to act. Her first and most important ally was the newspaper itself. Street. Clair understood the power of the press in a way that was remarkable for her era and extraordinary for someone in her position. She had been placing paid advertisements in black newspapers for years. Not advertisements for her numbers operation, but public notices in which she addressed the community directly. Some were personal, warnings to suitors and rivals to leave her alone. Some were educational, detailed explanations of citizens' legal rights during police encounters, including the right to refuse a search without a warrant. Some were political, denunciations of police brutality, corrupt officials, and the systematic harassment of black residents by law enforcement. These advertisements served multiple purposes. They established St. Clair as a public figure whose activities were documented and visible, making it harder for the police to move against her in secret. And they built her reputation in the community as someone who fought for the rights of ordinary people, not just for her own profit. And they created a public record, a paper trail of accusations and disclosures that could be referenced later if the authorities attempted to rewrite history. In a world where black people's testimony was routinely disbelieved, ignored, or suppressed, the act of putting your accusations in print was a form of insurance. Her second crucial ally was the Seabury Commission itself, or more precisely, the political dynamics that made the commission possible. Judge Seabury was investigating corruption at the request of the New York State Legislature, and his investigators were actively seeking witnesses. St. Clair made herself available. She offered to testify about the payments she had made, the officers who had accepted them, and the arrangements that had governed the relationship between the numbers operators and the police. She was, in effect, volunteering to burn down her own house in order to expose the arsonists. Her third ally was her chief enforcer, a young man named Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Johnson was in his late 20s at the time, a native of Charleston, South Carolina, and who had been sent to Harlem as a teenager and had quickly established himself as one of the most formidable street fighters in the neighborhood. St. Clair had hired him as a bodyguard and numbers runner, and he had risen through her organization to become her most trusted lieutenant. Johnson was known for his intelligence, his love of literature and philosophy, and his capacity for extreme violence when he judged it necessary. He was the physical arm of Saint, a Clair's operation, the man who ensured that her commands were carried out and that her person was protected. While St. Clair prepared her institutional counterattack through the press and the Seabury Commission, Johnson and his crew of approximately 9 men waged what Mamie Hatcher Johnson, Bumpy's wife, would later describe as a guerrilla war against Schultz's operations in Harlem, systematically targeting his men and disrupting his business. The relationship between St. Clair and Johnson was, by all accounts, one of mutual respect rather than romantic attachment, though rumors of a deeper connection persisted for decades. What is clear from the historical record is that their partnership was extraordinarily effective. St. Clair provided the strategic vision, the financial resources, the institutional connections, and the public persona. Johnson provided the tactical execution, the street-level intelligence, and the physical force. She was the mind of the operation. He was its fist. And the combination was more potent than either element would have been alone. St. Clair was approximately 20 years older than Johnson, or 10 years, depending on which birth year one accepts, and she had been running criminal enterprises since before he arrived in Harlem. She was, in every meaningful sense, his mentor. She taught him how to think about power as a system rather than a series of personal confrontations, and that education would serve him for the rest of his life. But when Johnson eventually became the most powerful figure in Harlem's underworld, he was building on foundations that Stephanie St. Clair had laid. The fourth element of St. Clair's coalition was the community itself. She had invested years in building relationships with ordinary Harlemites, not through charity alone, though she was generous, but through employment. Her numbers operation employed between 40 and 50 runners, 10 comptrollers, and several bodyguards. It financed small businesses that served as collection points for bets. It was, for hundreds of families, a source of income in a neighborhood where legitimate employment was scarce, and discriminatory hiring practices made conventional work difficult to obtain. When St. Clair asked the community to boycott white-owned businesses that fronted for Schultz's betting operations, she was not asking strangers. She was asking people whose livelihoods she had supported and whose trust she had earned. And the strategy that St. Clair developed was a four-front campaign that operated simultaneously on economic, legal, informational, and military levels. No single front would have been sufficient on its own. Together, they constituted the most sophisticated assault on organized crime's expansion into Harlem that anyone, man or woman, black or white, had ever attempted. The economic front was the community boycott, street. Clair identified the white-owned storefronts in Harlem that served as drop-off points for Schultz's numbers operation and organized campaigns to deprive them of black customers. She also attacked some of these businesses directly, sending her men to vandalize or shut down establishments that cooperated with the white mob. The goal was to make it economically painful for Harlem businesses to serve as conduits for Schultz's operation, thereby disrupting his collection network at the street level. On the legal front was the Seabury testimony. By offering detailed, specific, and verifiable information about police corruption, names, dates, amounts, St. Clair placed herself at considerable personal risk, but she also created a problem that neither Schultz nor his police allies could solve through intimidation. Her testimony was now part of an official government record. Silencing her would not erase it, and the political consequences of her disclosures, the suspension of a police lieutenant and more than a dozen officers, sent a signal to the department that the cost of protecting Schultz in Harlem was rising. The informational front was the newspaper campaign. St. Clair continued to place advertisements and write columns in the Amsterdam News and other black publications, exposing the details of Schultz's operation, naming the corrupt officers who facilitated it, and educating the community about its legal rights. She was, in effect, conducting a one-woman public relations campaign against the most dangerous gangster in the Bronx, using his name in print, in advertisements that ran alongside society notices and church announcements. The audacity of this cannot be overstated. People who crossed Dutch Schultz ended up dead. St. Clair not only crossed him, she signed her name to the crossing and attached a photograph of herself, dressed impeccably. Oh, for good measure. The military front was Bumpy Johnson. While St. Clair worked the institutional channels, Johnson and his men conducted a campaign of targeted violence against Schultz's enforcers in Harlem. This was not a large-scale war. Johnson's crew was small, approximately 9 men, but it was effective because it exploited a simple geographical fact. Schultz's men were white, and Harlem was black. As Mamie Johnson would later observe, picking off Schultz's operatives was relatively easy because there were few other white men walking around Harlem during the day. Johnson's crew could identify, track, and ambush Schultz's people with a tactical advantage that no amount of firepower could overcome. Each of these 4 fronts reinforced the others. The boycotts disrupted Schultz's revenue. The Seabury testimony eroded his police protection, and the newspaper campaign built public support for resistance and made it politically costly for officials to side with the white mob. And Johnson's guerrilla operations made it physically dangerous for Schultz's men to operate in Harlem. The strategy was, in its totality, a textbook example of asymmetric warfare, a smaller, weaker force using every available tool to offset the advantages of a larger, stronger opponent. The campaign did not produce instant results. It unfolded over months and years, from the early 1930s through the middle of the decade, with periods of intense activity and periods of relative quiet. The violence continued on both sides. Schultz placed a contract on St. Clair's life, and there were periods when she was forced into hiding. According to one account, she was at one point reduced to concealing herself in a cellar covered in coal dust to evade Schultz's assassins. This was not the image of Madame Queen that the newspapers printed. It was the reality of what it meant to fight a war against an opponent who had the police, the political establishment, and the full resources of the white underworld at his disposal. But the pressure built. St. Clair's intelligence about Schultz's operations, channeled through her newspaper campaigns and through tips to sympathetic law enforcement, led to a series of raids on his clearinghouses. In one of the most significant of these operations, police raided a Schultz operation and arrested more than a dozen of his employees while seizing approximately $2 million, some accounts say as much as $12 million, in cash and records. St. Clair, characteristically, took public credit for the tip that led to the raid. She bragged about it in the press. This was not recklessness, it was strategy. By publicly claiming responsibility, she demonstrated to the community that resistance was possible and to Schultz that his operations were not beyond reach. The Seabury Commission's work, meanwhile, was producing systemic effects. The testimony that St. Clair and others had provided led to the suspension and dismissal of more than a dozen officers, some accounts say more than 30, from the New York Police Department. The Commission's findings contributed to a broader atmosphere of scrutiny that would eventually bring down Tammany Hall, the corrupt Democratic political machine that had governed New York City for decades. Jimmy Hines, the Tammany politician who had provided Schultz with political protection, would eventually be prosecuted by Thomas Dewey, the ambitious district attorney who used the corruption cases as a stepping stone to the governorship and, ultimately, to 2 presidential nominations. The effects of the boycotts and the guerrilla campaign were harder to measure but no less real. Schultz's operations in Harlem became increasingly costly to maintain. His enforcers were at risk every time they entered the neighborhood. His collection network was disrupted by the loss of cooperating storefronts. The percentage of the Harlem numbers business that he could reliably control, while substantial, was never complete, and the resistance, led by St. Clair and Johnson, was a persistent and visible reminder that the takeover was not accepted. What made St. Clair's resistance remarkable was not merely its courage, but its intelligence. She understood something that most people in her position, facing an overwhelming opponent, would not have grasped, that the battle was not about holding territory in the conventional sense. It was about raising costs. Every dollar that Schultz spent protecting his enforcers in Harlem was a dollar that reduced his profits. Every officer suspended because of the Seabury testimony was a piece of his protection network removed. Every newspaper advertisement that named his operations publicly made it harder for his political allies to maintain their support without scrutiny. St. Clair did not need to defeat Schultz outright. She needed to make Harlem more trouble than it was worth, and she was succeeding. Meanwhile, her newspaper columns continued their work of community education. She published information about citizens' rights during police stops. She explained the mechanics of how corrupt officers operated so that ordinary people could recognize and resist shakedowns. She named names. In an era when black newspapers were among the most important institutions in African American life, serving simultaneously as news sources, community bulletin boards, and instruments of political mobilization, St. Clair's columns reached thousands of readers who had no other source of information about the systems that governed their lives. She was, in her way, doing the work of a journalist, a lawyer, and a community organizer, all while running an illegal business and fighting a literal war against the most violent gangster in the Bronx. The end of Dutch Schultz did not come at the hands of Stephanie St. Clair or Bumpy Johnson. It came from within the system of organized crime itself. By 1935, Schultz had become a problem for the broader mafia leadership. His operations in Harlem had drawn unwanted attention from law enforcement. His violent temperament had made him unpredictable, and his plan to assassinate Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor who was building cases against organized crime's leadership, it was seen by the Commission, the ruling body of the 5 major mafia families in New York, as an act of suicidal recklessness that would bring the full force of the federal government down on all of them. Charles Lucky Luciano, who had positioned himself as the most powerful figure in organized crime, refused to authorize the hit on Dewey. Instead, the Commission authorized a hit on Schultz. On October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz was shot at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. Had he lingered for hours, delirious and incoherent, before dying the following day. Stephanie St. Clair had nothing to do with the assassination. She had not ordered it, facilitated it, or participated in any conspiracy to bring it about. But she had one final move to make. From wherever she was that night, she sent a telegram to Schultz's hospital bed. It contained a single biblical verse. "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." She signed it, Madam Queen of Policy. Consider what this act required. A black woman operating in a world where crossing a man like Schultz had cost more than 40 people their lives, sent a signed message to his deathbed, not anonymously, not through an intermediary. She signed her title. She wanted him to know who had sent it. She wanted the world to know. The telegram was not a threat. The man was already dying. It was a statement. It said, "I am still here. You are not. And everyone who reads this will know that I outlasted you." And the telegram reportedly made headlines across black newspapers nationwide. It became the defining act of St. Clair's public life, a gesture so audacious and so perfectly timed that it cemented her legend in Harlem's collective memory forever. The telegram reportedly made headlines across the nation. It was the last public act in a war that had lasted half a decade, claimed more than 40 lives, and reshuffled the power structure of organized crime in New York City. Street. Clair had not won the war in the conventional sense. Schultz's territories, including much of the Harlem numbers racket, were absorbed by the Luciano organization. The mafia's control over the neighborhood's underground economy was, in many ways, solidified rather than broken. But St. Clair had survived. She had not submitted. She had not been silenced. She had not been silenced. She had not been killed, and she had accomplished something that no other numbers operator in Harlem, male or female, or black or white, had managed. She had fought Dutch Schultz to a standstill and lived to send a message to his deathbed. The visible victory was not a single event, but a transformation of St. Clair's position, of the community's awareness, and of the institutional landscape that had enabled the exploitation of Harlem. St. Clair, having weathered the war with Schultz, transitioned out of the numbers business. She passed operational control to Bumpy Johnson, who negotiated a new arrangement with the Luciano organization that gave him authority over Harlem's rackets in exchange for a percentage flowing to the Italian families. This arrangement was far from ideal. It formalized the mafia's presence in the neighborhood, but it also established that black leadership of Harlem's underground economy could not simply be eliminated. Johnson's position as the intermediary between the community and the mafia was a direct consequence of the war that St. Clair had waged. Without her resistance, there would have been nothing to negotiate. The mafia would have taken everything. The institutional victories were more concrete. The Seabury Commission's findings, to which St. Clair's testimony contributed, led to the dismissal of corrupt police officers, the exposure of judicial corruption, and ultimately the downfall of the Tammany Hall machine. Mayor Jimmy Walker, who had presided over the era of systemic corruption, was forced to resign. And the Commission's work laid the groundwork for the election of Fiorello LaGuardia, the reform mayor who promised to clean up city government. St. Clair had not, of course, single-handedly brought about these changes, but she had been one of the witnesses whose testimony gave the Commission the evidence it needed, and she had done so at a time when testifying against the police as a black woman operating an illegal business was an act of extraordinary courage. And the community victory was perhaps the most significant, though it was also the most difficult to quantify. St. Clair's public campaign, her newspaper advertisements, her columns in the Amsterdam News, her open defiance of both the police and the white mob, had established a model of resistance that the neighborhood would remember. She had demonstrated that it was possible to fight back against systemic exploitation even when the odds were overwhelming. Yet even when the institutions that were supposed to protect you were arrayed against you, she had shown that the weapons of the weak, information, publicity, strategic alliances, the willingness to speak truth in public, could be wielded with devastating effect against opponents who relied on secrecy, corruption, and the assumption that black people would submit in silence. After the war with Schultz, Stephanie St. Clair entered a new phase of her life. She stepped away from the numbers racket and devoted herself increasingly to activism and community advocacy. She continued to write columns and place advertisements in black newspapers, addressing issues of police brutality, discrimination, and the legal rights of black citizens. She formed the French Legal Society, dedicated to supporting black immigrants from the Caribbean and French-speaking countries who faced the double burden of racial discrimination and linguistic isolation. She understood their situation intimately because she had lived it. She had arrived in New York speaking French and carrying nothing, and she had navigated a world that was hostile to her on every axis: race, gender, national origin, language, and class. The legal aid work she did for immigrant communities was not widely publicized and has received little attention from historians. But it represented a significant investment of time and resources on behalf of people who had no one else to advocate for them. She also continued her newspaper work with a consistency that bordered on compulsion. Where other former racketeers might have faded into quiet retirement, St. Clair remained visible in print, issuing pronouncements on everything from corrupt landlords to the quality of public education in Harlem. She saw the newspaper not merely as a tool for self-promotion, but as an instrument of community power. In a neighborhood where black residents were systematically denied access to political institutions, where their complaints to City Hall were ignored, where the police who were supposed to protect them were instead the source of much of the violence they endured, the black press was one of the few institutions that could not be controlled by outside forces. Street. Clair had recognized this truth early and had built her entire public strategy around it. Even after she left the numbers game, she never left the newspaper. Her personal life was turbulent. In 1936, she entered into a contractual, non-legal marriage with Sufi Abdul Hamid, a flamboyant and controversial activist who was known in the press as Black Hitler for his anti-Semitic rhetoric. The relationship was tempestuous. In January 1938, St. Clair shot Hamid during an altercation. Reportedly, after learning of an affair, she was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 2 to 10 years at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women. During her sentencing, the presiding judge observed that she had been living by her wits all of her life. As she was led from the courtroom, she reportedly kissed her hand to freedom. After her release from prison in the early 1940s, St. Clair lived quietly. She transitioned successfully into legitimate business. When a New York Post reporter interviewed her in 1960 for a series on the history of the Harlem numbers racket, he described her as a prosperous businesswoman living a lavish lifestyle in a 4-story apartment that she owned in Harlem. She was, by that point in her 60s, still sharp, still fashionable, still unwilling to be defined by anyone's narrative but her own. Bumpy Johnson, her former enforcer, had by then become the most powerful figure in Harlem's underworld, a position he had achieved in large part because of the foundation that St. Clair had built and the lessons she had taught him about the relationship between street power and institutional power. Whether Johnson ever actually called St. Clair the bravest person he ever met, as the oral tradition of Harlem maintains, cannot be verified. No published biography, interview, or archival document records the specific phrase. But the claim is not implausible. Johnson had spent his youth in St. Clair's orbit. He had watched her face down Dutch Schultz, the New York Police Department, and the full machinery of white organized crime. He had seen her choose exposure over submission, testimony over silence, transparency over the code of the streets. He had seen her survive things that killed other people. If he said it, he was not exaggerating. And if he did not say it, someone should have. Stephanie Street. Clair died in December 1969 in central Islip, New York. She was approximately 72 years old, though even in death, the uncertainty about her birth year persisted. Her death was not mentioned in any newspaper of the era. The woman who had once placed full-page advertisements in the black press, who had signed telegrams to dying mobsters, who had testified before government commissions and written columns about legal rights and police corruption, passed from the world in silence. Bumpy Johnson had died the year before, in July 1968, of a heart attack at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. The waitress had just served him coffee, a chicken leg, and hominy grits. The silence that attended her death was, in its way, the final insult of a life defined by the refusal to be silenced. The white press had never paid sustained attention to her story, except when it intersected with the stories of white men, Dutch Schultz, Lucky Luciano, the Seabury Commission. The black press, which had been her megaphone and her shield, had by 1969 moved on to other battles, other heroes, other emergencies. The civil rights movement had transformed the landscape of American racial politics in ways that made the story of a 1930s numbers queen seem like ancient history. But the issues that St. Clair had fought over, police corruption, economic exploitation, the denial of financial services to black communities, at the use of the criminal justice system as a weapon against black enterprise, had not been resolved. They had simply taken new forms. In the decade since her death, St. Clair's story has been recovered, slowly and incompletely, by historians and storytellers. Shirley Stewart's biography, published in 2013, provided the most thorough account of her life. LaShawn Harris, a historian specializing in the underground economies of black urban communities, placed St. Clair in the broader context of African American women's entrepreneurship and resistance. The television series Godfather of Harlem, which premiered in 2019, featured St. Clair as a character, though the series focused primarily on Bumpy Johnson's story rather than hers. A graphic novel, Queenie, Godmother of Harlem, appeared in 2021. HBO announced a film based on her life, though as of this writing the project's status remains uncertain. In each of these retellings, St. Clair emerges not as a footnote in someone else's story, but as a figure whose life demands its own narrative. The legacy of Stephanie St. Clair is not a monument or a holiday or a law bearing her name. It is something quieter and, in its way, more durable. It is the demonstration, preserved in newspaper archives and government records and the oral history of a neighborhood, that a black woman who arrived in America as a servant could build an empire, defend it against the most dangerous men in New York, expose the corruption of the institutions that were supposed to serve her community, and emerge, not unscathed, not uncomplicated, not innocent, but alive and wealthy and free. She did not achieve this through violence alone, though she was capable of violence. She did not achieve it through money alone, though she had money. She achieved it through a combination of intelligence, audacity, strategic thinking, and an absolute refusal to accept the role that the world had assigned her. She was a black immigrant woman in a city that treated all three of those identities as grounds for exploitation. She took the exploitation and turned it into an empire. She took the empire and turned it into a weapon. She took the weapon and aimed it at the people who thought they were beyond her reach. She was wrong about some things. She was complicit in others. The numbers racket that built her fortune was, for all its community benefits, a form of gambling that extracted money from people who could not afford to lose it. Her judgment in personal relationships was, by any measure, poor. Her life does not fit the template of a moral hero, and it should not be forced into one. But the specific quality that the oral tradition attributes to her, bravery, is not in dispute. She was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the bravest people to walk the streets of Harlem in the 20th century. She proved it not once, not in a single dramatic moment, but repeatedly, over years, in the face of threats that would have silenced anyone with less steel in their character. And her bravery was not the reckless kind, not the bravery of someone who does not understand the consequences. It was the calculated bravery of a woman who understood exactly what Dutch Schultz could do to her, who had watched his men murder her associates and terrorize her community, and who chose to fight anyway. And it was the bravery of a woman who walked into the Seabury Commission and testified about her own crimes in order to expose the crimes of others. It was the bravery of a woman who signed her name to newspaper advertisements that accused powerful men of corruption, knowing that any one of those men could have had her killed. It was, above all, the bravery of a woman who refused to accept that her place in the world had been determined by the circumstances of her birth, that because she was black, because she was a woman, because she was an immigrant, because she was poor, she was supposed to submit. She never submitted. Not to Dutch Schultz, not to the police, not to the mafia, not to anyone. Harlem remembers. Not all of its memories are recorded. Not all of its stories have been published, but the ones that persist, the ones that survive the loss of witnesses and the erosion of time and the indifference of official history, persist because they contain something true. And the story of the woman who refused to bow, who fought when fighting seemed futile, who spoke when speaking seemed suicidal, and who lived to see her enemies destroyed, that story persists. It persists in a neighborhood that has always understood something that the rest of the world has been slow to learn: that power does not belong to the people who hold it by default. It belongs to the people who are willing to pay the price of taking it. Stephanie St. Clair paid that price in full, and she never asked for a receipt.